The neighbor kept the garden. That's what everyone said first. Not his name, not his job, just the neighbor with the garden. As if that was enough identity for a man. And honestly, at that time, it was. Because it was a beautiful garden. Too beautiful, maybe. If I'm being honest in hindsight, but hindsight always tries to sound smarter than it was. Back then, it just looked like effort, care, discipline, things we like to see in people. I moved in 3 houses down. He introduced himself on the second day. He smiled in a way that felt practiced, but not fake. There's a difference. Fake smiles try too hard. His didn't try at all. That should have meant something. But I only remember thinking he seemed reliable. The kind of person who notices when things are out of place. The kind of person who fixes them. He brought me tomatoes once, from his garden, still warm from the sun. He said, "You should eat these quickly. Fresh is better when it doesn't have time to think." I laughed. I remember laughing. Because people say strange things sometimes, and you don't want to make them feel strange for saying them. The garden grew fast, faster than seasons should allow. By midsummer, it had become the focal point of the street. Neighbors slowed their cars to look. Children stopped near the fence. Even people who didn't usually stop for anything stopped. And the neighbors always waved, always smiled, always looked like he expected to be seen. There were small inconsistencies first. Things you only notice when you've already decided to trust someone. A patch of soil that didn't match the rest. A section of fence always freshly repainted. A faint smell at night fertilizer, maybe, or something older pretending to be fertilizer. I asked him once what he used to soil enrichment. He paused, just lightly, then said, "Whatever the ground gives back." I didn't ask what that meant. I should have. The roses grew too straight. That was the first thing I couldn't explain away. Roses don't grow straight. They lean. They reach. They hesitate. His didn't. They rose vertically like they had been instructed. Like gravity was optional if you obeyed something else. He started inviting people over. Not parties, not events, just walkthroughs. He'd stand by the gate and say, "Come see what's been added." People went. People always went. And when they came back, they were quieter, not scared, just adjusted, like something had been calibrated in them without permission. The first real crack in the story came from a dog, a stray. It wandered into the garden one afternoon. I remember barking, running, fence shaking. Then silence. And when I looked out again, the neighbor was kneeling on the soil, patting it gently, like comforting something underground. He looked up at me and smiled, then said, "Animals don't understand boundaries yet." I remember feeling relieved at that, as if he was the reasonable one. That was the problem. He always sounded reasonable, even when nothing about it made sense. I started noticing missing pets, not just mine, the streets. Cats first, then smaller things people stopped naming out loud. Someone asked him once if he'd seen them. He said, "The garden takes what it needs to stay balanced." Laughter. Not his. Other people laughed, nervous, relieved, because that kind of sentence should have sounded insane. But it sounded poetic. And poetry is how people avoided responsibility. I didn't go near the fence for a while after that, but I kept watching, and the garden kept growing, even at night, not visibly, but noticeably different in the morning, like it had rearranged itself while no one was looking, like it preferred darkness as working hours. Then came the invitation, personal this time. He knocked on my door, carried a small basket of fruit, and said, "You haven't seen the back section yet." I said I was busy. He smiled and said, "It's better if you see it willingly." That line stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit, because it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like advice. I went. Of course I went. Because curiosity is just trust that hasn't been punished yet. He opened the gate to the back section, and I realized I had never seen it before. Not once, even though I thought I had. There were rows, too many rows, not of flowers, not of vegetables. Something closer to organization than cultivation. Everything spaced evenly, everything labeled, everything accounted for. And I understood, slowly, what the garden actually was. It wasn't growing plants, it was organizing absence, filling it, redirecting it, making it useful. I asked him what it was. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked around like he was checking if anything had been missed. Then he said, "You know how neighborhoods need to feel complete?" I said nothing. He continued, "People notice when something is missing. This helps them not notice." That was the moment I realized no one in the neighborhood was asking where things went anymore. They were just admiring how complete everything looked, how peaceful, how finished. I stopped pretending it was harmless because I saw the irrigation system. And it wasn't water. Not exactly. And I saw the shed, which wasn't a shed in the way sheds are usually sheds. It was storage for what people don't ask about twice. He noticed me noticing. Of course he did. He always noticed. That was his gift. That was the point. He came over and said softly, "You're thinking too loudly." I asked him what he meant. He said, "The garden hears that." And I understood then what had happened to the streets. It wasn't being haunted, it was being maintained. Like something constantly corrected for deviation. Like loss was being repurposed into structure. And he was the one doing it. Patiently. Quietly. Lovingly, even. I asked him where everything went. He finally stopped smiling. Not completely. Just enough to show there was a version of him that didn't need to perform friendliness anymore. And he said, "Nowhere." Then added, "It just stops being inconvenient." The next morning, the street looked unchanged. That was the worst part. Nothing looked wrong. Everything looked improved. Even the spaces where things used to be. Even the questions people stopped asking. Even me. People still talk about the garden. People say it's the most beautiful part of the neighborhood. They say we're lucky to have someone who cares that much. They say it feels safe. And when they say it, they don't look at the fence anymore. They look at the flowers. They always look at the flowers. Sometimes I think about leaving, but I don't know what would follow me, or if anything would even notice I'm gone, because the neighbor still waves when I walk past, still smiles, still tends the garden like nothing is ever out of place. And in a way, nothing is. Not anymore. The neighbor kept the garden, and now the whole street does too.